mind map revision of Paul and Meehan. Don't forget, these mind maps are at the core of your preparation. You're going to use them now over the course of the next 5 or 6 weeks to just remind yourself of the core principles or the core features of these different aspects of the course. So, how do I write a poetry essay? Go back and look at the poetry essay mind map. What do I need to know about Macbeth's character? Go back and look at the Macbeth mind map. How do I revise Paul and Meehan's poetry? Well, go back and look at your mind map and watch this video. Again, there'll be matching videos as we go along. Don't forget, this is, if you've been in my classes this year, and there's been a lot of people in my classes this year, you'll have the maps, and they're very useful to you for your revision. If you're not in my classes and you're just watching this on YouTube, and you want copies of these notes, you can email me at pmcbrunner@icloud, and you can purchase them, okay? So here we go, Paul and Meehan. So the 6 Paul and Meehan poems I teach are Buying Winkles, My Father Perceived as a Statue of St. Francis, Death of a Field, Cora Auntie, Hearth Lesson, Prayer for the Children of Longing. Now you'll also see on YouTube there is a video explanation of the pattern and also of the Statue of the Virgin at Granard Speaks. So that's 8 poems. Now don't forget, you're looking to have 5, maybe 6 poems prepared. The reason I have those poems highlighted in different colours is because something you need to know about Meehan's poetry is that her work addresses personal themes, but also addresses social and cultural issues. And I think it's very important that when you're preparing your poems, that you have a couple from each group, okay? So the ones in yellow there, they're poems about Meehan's childhood, her formative relationships, her mum, her dad, her identity. But the ones in green, they're obviously, they come from her, so there's an element of the personal, but they're really social commentary. And we'll talk about that in a second, but I would highly recommend you have, and the pattern fits into the yellow, the personal, and the Statue of the Virgin at Granard Speaks fits into the green, the social commentary. So when you're talking about Meehan, in terms of your preparation, I would definitely have a couple of poems from each of those categories prepared. And don't forget, there's lots of precedent for questions on poets. Just look at last year's exam in Adrian Rich, where they ask about those divergent thematic concerns. What do we know about her work? She, besides the fact she addresses both personal and social concerns, well, her poems are often memory poems, so they're reflective. She's looking back on events of the past and thinking about the impact or the importance of those events, but also she often employs a quite engaging and interesting narrative style. So kind of like Elizabeth Bishop or Derek Meehan, those two kind of jump out of my mind when I'm thinking about this style. She explores her themes through effective storytelling. She's a very, very, very talented storyteller, and that's a motif that connects the different poems under discussion. Motif, a recurring feature of her work. On that, you know that her poetry, like any story, any narrative, needs characters, and her poems are filled with characters, interesting characters, and there's a list of them there. The mother in Hearth Lesson, her father in Hearth Lesson, and my father envisioned that as St. Francis, the young drug addicts in Prayer for the Children of Longing, and so on. And again, in the pattern, her mother, and in the Statue of the Virgin at Granard Speaks, we have the personification of the Virgin herself as she speaks, but also the young girl who was tragically died, and who inspired that poem. When you're thinking about her poems, think about her personal poems, there's certain language you want to use. Think about good personal writing. What is good personal writing? It's honest and it's reflective. And her poetry, the poems that look at her youth and her, those years when she was living in Sean McDermott Street or out in Finglas and growing up and becoming aware of the world around her, those are her formative years, and she talks about those in very strikingly honest language. But also for me, one of the things that strikes me about Meehan, and for me, I'm allowed to have this opinion, indicates that she does owe a debt, well, that's the wrong way of putting it, that she was influenced by the work of Patrick Kavanagh in some way, is that her poems are often a celebration of ordinary people. You read a poem like Cora Auntie, or read a poem like My Father Perceived as a Vision of St. Francis. It's just they're really fantastic celebrations of those people. Those ordinary people, her Auntie Cora, her dad, who maybe didn't make a big impact on the world in a macro sense, but the poet takes the time to draw them, to remember them, to celebrate them, and to recognise that their lives had value. And that's an important thematic concern you see in those poems. And there's some brilliant quotes there. They're all, like all of those quotes that I have in that box there are very, very good. I do love that image, a perfect vision of St. Francis made whole, made young again in a fingless garden. And the reason I love that is because of the juxtaposition of the extraordinary with the ordinary. The Finglas garden, a suburban garden, nothing special. There's loads of gardens in Finglas. There's loads of people live in suburban areas. But there was something singular and something special about her dad. And it's that idea, as I said, a Kavanagh-esque idea of the celebration of the everyday miracles, of taking the time to, and this is what Meehan does, to recognise the worth, the value, the importance of people who maybe otherwise, in our lives we might take for granted. Cora Auntie is a killer of a poem. Like, it's a brilliant poem. And that image from Cora Auntie, when she thinks of her Auntie Cora, she thinks of her name, Cora, maiden, from the Greek Cora, promising blossom, summer, the scent of thyme. That really beautiful nature imagery that she associates with her aunt, those images of beauty, those images of vitality, those images of positivity. Like, they again communicate that this woman, who possibly had a very difficult life as a migrant, who went to London, and maybe life was tough. She had cancer. She was had a bottle of Jameson in one hand. She was debilitated by the disease. She ended up in a wheelchair. But when the poet thinks of her, she thinks of nature in full bloom, beauty and wonder. So that's important. Those personal poems, however, are not nostalgic. They don't ignore the harsh realities of life, and while they are deeply personal, they are also entirely relatable for that reason of celebrating the ordinary, but also because they recognise that life is not easy. So have a look at these poems. Again, these are just examples. I loved, if you've been in my class, I think my favourite image from Paula Meehan's poetry is I'm crouched by the fire in the flat in Shaw McDermott Street while Zeus and Hera battle it out. It's just a round of applause moment. The classical allusion, the choice of the verb crouched, the juxtaposition of the ordinary and the extraordinary, all of those things make that an image that just pops off the page. You've got this sense of a child who's beside the hearth, and the hearth is supposed to be a place where you are. It's a symbol of love and family and nurturing. But what did she learn when she was a child? Well, she learned fear, and she's crouching. That verb choice is so precise, so exact, so impactful. And then this image of her parents as Zeus and Hera, and all that implies their power, the sense of awe felt by the child when she looks at the parents, but also the conflict and the battle, because Zeus and Hera famously fought a lot, and a lot of the fighting was to do with Zeus's infidelity. So there's all of these things going on under the surface. And again, if you know me, I love poetry when it has depth, complexity, substance, that rewards repeated reading, that has to be deciphered, that challenges me as a reader to think. That's what great poetry for me is, and that's a good example of it. There are other examples of her, kind of unflinching depiction of struggle. Her mother's poverty in Heart Lesson, it's not enough, she stated simply, and we knew it wasn't. And then this image of Cora and Cora Auntie, this girl who is depicted so beautifully standing on a table as her mother and her aunts, alter her dress before she goes out into the world, and then the reality of what her life ended up as her body withered and her eyes grew darker and stranger as her hair grew back after chemo. That's unsparing and yet loving and beautiful. There is a sense of her determined to remember her auntie in her entirety, both as she was as a young person, but also as she was in those difficult later years. So, and I get that verb withered, tying in with the image of her promising blossom and the scent of time. So, that idea of the fact that life is a journey that goes through seasons, not summer, autumn and winter, but youth, middle age and old age. And that's what's being described there in a very thoughtful and personal way, but also in a way which is relatable. I love the image from Buying Winkles when she says, "My mother would spare me sixpence." I just love that because it says so much about her mother's kindness, generosity, the family's poverty, because if she had to, sixpence is a nominal amount of money, a small amount of money, but if she had to spare her the sixpence, that means she didn't have much money. And yet this act of love, this act of sacrifice, this act of generosity that just captures what parents do, almost, I'm sure there are exceptions, but that's what parents do. They sacrifice for their children. It's captured there. And then the protective, hurry up now and don't be talking to strange men on the way. Lovely, lovely piece of dialogue that she integrates into the poem. Again, highlighting her narrative approach, bringing those characters to life in a realistic way, in an engaging way, in a memorable way. The poet also, if you're going to talk about her narrative style in those personal poems, she brings settings to life. And again, there are so many examples of her ability to bring settings to life. And it's not just in the narrative poems. Death of a Field, you see it. Certainly in The Statue of Virgin that Granard speaks, you see it. Prayer for the Children of Longing. All of those poems you have, really kind of vivid setting descriptions. But, there are certain moments in her poems which just catch it. She just nails it. And for me, the two best are from Cora Auntie and My Father Perceived. And in Cora Auntie, she just describes how as a child she was fascinated with these sparkly, I can't remember what they're called, that were on the auntie's dress. They're worthless, of no value whatsoever. And they were sprinkled all over the house. And the child would go around looking for them. And she says she'd look for them in the split in the sofa, in a tear in the armchair, in the home of a shy mouse. And you ask yourself, why is she talking about the split in the sofa or the tear in the armchair? Well, it's because they were poor. And she's bringing the reality of that place where the furniture was kind of broken down and old and they couldn't replace it because they didn't have much money. And the reality of that place is brought, to life for the reader by her precise attention to detail. Elizabeth Bishop, we know, is famous for her forensic and meticulous eye for detail. Why can't you say that about Paula Meehan? Indeed, most of the poets on the course. This one here, as a man who grew up in a place where there were often horses tied to railings in the field at the top of Ayr Road in Rolla in Clondalkin, this made me smile when I read it. Like she's a woman who's a working class Dublin woman, and she describes, scenes from working class Dublin life. It was the piebald horse, in the next door's garden, frightened me out of a dream with her Dawn Winnie. Just that wonderful, note that there was a piebald horse, in the next door's garden. Very unusual, but very realistic, a very realistic depiction of, life in a working class area at a certain time. She's talking about the 70s, I grew up in the 80s, wouldn't have been that unusual. But then it's the onomatopoeia of that whinny. And you can hear that sound, and it appeals to the aural sense, and it just plunges you into, or immerses. I love that verb, immerses the reader into the world of the poem, making the poetry. We'll change the word now. Immersive. Use that as an adjective. Okay, appealing to the aural sense. So think about looking at some of those personal poems. Think about her narrative style. Think about her attention to detail. But also really do think about her social commentary poems. So you have to think about those social commentary poems. And again, the fact that when you read a Paula Meehan poem, she causes us to think about those or issues to do with the society in which we live. So she's a poet with a social conscience, but I don't believe she's a poet who is a proselytizer or a preacher. She's not someone out there on a mission to change our minds. She's just commenting on the world as she sees it, and she does it in a brilliantly imaginative way. I'm going to have a sup of coffee here. So what issues does she deal with in those social commentary poems? One of the most current is our relationship with the environment and the sacrifice that we make when we live our modern lives. The price to be paid, I suppose, is a better way to put it, for our modern lives. She deals with that in Death of the Field, which is just as modern, as relevant, as pertinent a poem that I've come across on the Leaving Cert course. The only poem on the course that speaks to the modern world in which we live as much as that poem in terms of social awareness is The Armadillo by Elizabeth Bishop. She talks about drug addiction and the impact of drug addiction and the powerful, debilitating, effect of it on a whole community in Prayer for the Children of Longing, and then of course social exclusion and the role of the Catholic Church and society in the statue of the Virgin at Granard Speaks. These are really, really important quotes, but there's no quote that's more important than other one. So whatever quote your teacher's doing with you, just have your quotes ready. I love number 2 and 3 here, and I love number 5 as well. But number 2 and 3, just nail it every time. In Death of a Field, a poem in which he really examines, we need housing. You live in 2023, you're 17, 18 years of age, and 5 or 6 years' time, you're going to be looking at graduating from college, and you're going to want to buy somewhere to live. And we have this housing crisis where people on really good salaries, never mind working people, can't afford somewhere to live. So it's a theme that matters, but also we live in a world where environmental concerns are not theoretical, they are real world, and they're affecting the way we live our lives every day, making it more difficult. So that's why that poem is great. And I love the way she juxtaposes the artificial with the natural. I think it's 10 times in that section of that poem, Death of the Field. And just learn one example. The end of Dandelion is the start of Flash. The end of Doc is the start of Pledge. Just think about those juxtapositions. They're really, really clever. You have the chemical detergents, the lists of them, and then you have the wondrous beauty of and variety of nature, and this repetition of the end of. The end of. And yes, the start of, but the end of has a tragedy, and the tragedy is emphasized by the start of, the chemical, the pollutants. And the question she's asking us is, is our modern life, is it sustainable? Is our modern life, are the sacrifices that we make, in other words, the price that nature pays for our modern life, is that justifiable? It's a really thought-provoking and interesting poem. I mentioned my favourite image from Meehan is Zeus and Hera battling it out while she crouches by the fire in Sean McDermott Street. This is a competitor as well, from Prayer for the Children of Longing. The scream, the siren, the knock on the door, the needle in its track, the knife in the back. I mean, if you're going to start off a Paul and Meehan essay with a quote, why not start with that one? It's a triad: scream, siren, knock. All those words are onomatopoeic, so appealing to the aural sense. Then you have this, cinematic close-up shots of a needle going into a vein, and then this haptic image, this, sense of your sense of touch of a knife going into the back, and it just captures the trauma, the ongoing pain, the suffering of a community racked by drug addiction. And it's incredibly vivid and powerful, and evidence of the poet's control over language. I love that image of the streets that couldn't shelter them, that spellbound them in alleyways, this idea that our community has let down these vulnerable people, the image of them kind of almost zombie-like, out of it from drugs in the alleyways. And then you have this, and this is, we all know, so famous and so brilliant, the Virgin, the statue of the Virgin, which has this, symbolism as a representative of the Catholic Church and then the wider society. Just seeing a vulnerable child and doing nothing to help. And though she cried out to me in extremis, I did not move. I didn't lift a finger to help her. And in those words, there is condemnation. In those words, there is exasperation. In those words, there is a poet who was writing, I don't know whether she did it deliberately, and I'm sure Paula Meehan could watch this video and say, Paul, you're talking shit about my poetry. But I'm allowed to interpret it. I think Paula Meehan there is with in a passionate yet controlled voice, highlighting the failures of an institution and a society which doesn't care, which is, on the one hand, deeply, devoutly religious and espouses these principles of Christianity, and then on the other hand, doesn't care or doesn't show any sense of concern for the most vulnerable in our society. And I know that's changed, and certainly that we are a more, in many ways, inclusive society than we were at the time the event happened in the 1980s. But it does make us think about the nature of our society. And then you just think about her use of language. Don't forget, your poetry questions will require you to talk about language. And as you know, I'm a big believer in just learning a symbol from each poem, a metaphor or a symbol from each poem, and just understanding what each symbol means. Like, what does the allusion to St. Francis represent in that poem? It represents the fact that her father was special, not run of the mill or everyday. A saint is, a saint because they are unique, special, worthy of celebration. So is her dad. I've already discussed the juxtaposition of the natural with the artificial in Death of a Field and what it symbolises. I was trying to look the word, the shiny things, the sequence in Cora Anti, shining and in many ways beautiful, but intrinsically of no value. And again, that's symbolic of Cora, but it's also symbolic of the poet. The point the poet is making, I suppose, about people in our lives that we sometimes that enrich our lives, but we take for granted. Zeus and Hera, I've mentioned. Just the idea of going out and buying the Winkles. The fact that the mother gave her the money, but also it's emblematic of childhood innocence, of adventure, of a world that has passed. The world always passes. Time moves on, and it just captures something about the character and the nature of the poet's childhood, but also the place in which she lived. And then you have, of course, the Christmas tree in Prayer for the Children of Longing, which is such a powerful symbol of pain, but also the possibility of the. When I say pain, I mean that it's put up in this community to try and celebrate a season, but it's a meager attempt to mitigate the terrible suffering around. But also it's a symbol of the possibility of renewal and moving on. Again, maybe owing a debt to Kavanagh and Advent. She uses simile really effectively. Highly recommend you learn a couple of those. And she's a master at repetition. It's 8, I thought it was 10 times, 8 times in Death of the Field she uses that phrase, the end of, the start of. Then in Prayer for the Children of Longing, here at the heart of winter, here at the heart of the city. And then in the same poem, that exhortation, let their names be. She wants these people to be remembered. Why does she want them to be remembered? Because like the 15-year-old girl in the statue of the Virgin at Granard Speaks, like the old woman who sells the Winkles, like her mother and like her father, these people are of value and they deserve to be remembered. So there you go. That's the Paula Meehan mind map revised. It's not everything you need to know about Paula Meehan, but I think it would probably help you when you're revising her. And again, if you're looking for copies of the notes, PMC Brunner at iCloud.